Hello, and thanks for joining us for this week's episode of Into the Killing. If you've listened to other episodes, you know we're looking for cases to cover on the podcast and our YouTube channels. For Into the Killing, we want to know about interesting cold cases that were eventually solved. On Criminally Listed, we cover all types of true crime stories. Then, on Paranormally Listed, we cover stories about the bizarre and the unexplained, like ghosts, monsters, and aliens. To suggest a case, please go to our website, criminallylisted.com. For this episode, we're going back to January 1975. On January 5th, 1975, actor Bradley Cooper was born in Bigton Township, which is outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Cooper became interested in acting at a young age. He made his television debut in 1999 with a small role in HBO's Sex and the City. 2 years later, he appeared in his first movie. It was the cult classic ensemble comedy Hot Wet American Summer. That same year, he got a supporting role on the ABC television series Alias. He was a regular in the first 2 seasons and made guest appearances in seasons 3 and 5. One of Cooper's first major roles in the film world was playing the antagonist in the comedy Wedding Crashers. But the major breakout role that made him one of the biggest stars in Hollywood was 2009's The Hangover. Since then, he's been nominated for 11 Academy Awards and won 2 Grammys. On January 6, 1975, the game show Wheel of Fortune debuted on NBC. The show was created by media mogul Merv Griffin, who also created Jeopardy! The show originally aired during the daytime. It was hosted by Chuck Woolery and Susan Stafford. The theme song was written by Alan Thicke, who later rose to fame as an actor. The night version, hosted by Pat Sajak and Vanna White, debuted in September 1983. Wheel of Fortune has continually been on the air since it debuted 48 years ago. On January 15, 1975, Space Mountain opened in Tomorrowland at Disney World in Florida. The indoor roller coaster was first conceived by Walt Disney in 1959. However, due to technical limitations, it couldn't be constructed. But in the early 1970s, Disney wanted to construct a duplicate of the Matterhorn bobslides roller coaster from Disneyland in Anaheim, California, in Disney World. However, it wasn't feasible, so work on Space Mountain began. It's considered the first roller coaster where riders are in complete darkness, so they don't know when the turns and drops will happen. The ride was incredibly popular and has been in operation since it opened. The ride has been duplicated and can be found at every Disney park in the world except Shanghai Disneyland Resort. Space Mountain at Disney World is supposedly haunted. We're going to talk about that in an upcoming video on our YouTube channel, Paranormally Listed. Please subscribe so you don't miss it. On January 26, 1975, the number 1 song was Laughter in the Rain by Neil Sedaka. The number 1 movie was Murder on the Orient Express, which was adapted from the classic novel of the same name by Agatha Christie. In January 1975, 22-year-old Teresa Clark was a graduate student at Southern Illinois University-Carbondale in Carbondale, Illinois. The university is known by the acronym SIU-C. Clark was studying speech pathology and audiology. Clark was from Lamont, Illinois. She had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. In Carbondale, she lived in an off-campus apartment with a roommate. On the last weekend of January 1975, Clark's roommate was out of town. She returned home on Sunday, January 27th. When she walked into the apartment, she was shocked by what she found. Blood was splattered around the apartment. She went into the bathroom. In the bathtub, which was full of water, was the new dead body of 22-year-old Teresa Clark. The roommate immediately called the police. The medical examiner determined that Clark had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. She had also been sexually assaulted. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. It appeared that the murder happened in the living room, and then, as Clark was dead or dying, her body was dragged into the bathroom. The killer probably put it in the bathtub in hopes of destroying any evidence. The police interviewed Clark's friends and neighbors. The last time anyone saw her alive was on the afternoon of Saturday, January 26th. So it's believed that she was killed that afternoon or that evening. Clark's parents said that she usually locked the door, so the police thought she may have let the killer into the apartment herself. The police thought that this indicated that she knew her killer, or at the very least, she felt comfortable letting him into her apartment. A few odd things were missing from the apartment. This included a kitchen knife, a bathrobe, an inexpensive camera, an ashtray, and some of her school papers. So the police did not believe that robbery was the motive. The police investigated the murder and sent some evidence, including fingerprints, to the FBI, but no leads were generated from this. The murder weapon was not found at the crime scene. The police did not know if the missing knife was the murder weapon. Unfortunately, after a few months, the case went cold. We're just going to take a break from this episode to bring you a message from our amazing sponsor, Babbel. If you have an upcoming summer trip abroad, my go-to travel hack is Babbel. Whether you're a seasoned traveler or embarking on your first adventure, communication is key to fully experiencing a new culture. That's where Babbel comes in. Babbel is the language learning app that sold more than 10 million subscriptions. Thanks to Babbel's addictively fun and easy bite-sized language lessons, there's still time to learn a new language before you reach your destination. For a while now, I've been learning Dutch, and I think at the end of the summer, I'm going to finally get to try out my Dutch skills in the Netherlands. I'll be able to read any menu with ease, so I don't accidentally order pickled herring or farm boys, which are dark raisins soaked in a sugary syrup and brandy. With Babbel, there are 14 languages you can learn. Anyone can learn with Babbel because it only takes about 10 minutes to complete the lessons, and then you can start having real-life conversations in as little as 3 weeks. Other language learning apps use AI to make their lessons. Babbel's lessons, on the other hand, were created by over 150 language experts. Plus, their lessons are voiced by real native speakers, and they're not computer-generated. Their expertly crafted lessons teach you to speak the language in real life, so you'll be able to have practical conversations about travel, relationships, business, and more. I know their teaching method is effective because I've been able to learn with it, but it's actually scientifically proven to be effective. They have amazing speech recognition technology, so it helps improve your pronunciation and accent. One of my favorite parts about Babbel is that there are a bunch of different ways to learn besides lessons. There are podcasts, games, video stories, and even live classes. Plus, there's nothing to lose because Babbel comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee. Start your new language learning journey today with Babbel. Right now, get up to 55% off your subscription when you go to babbel.com/listed. That's babbel.com/listed for up to 55% off your subscription. Babbel, language for life. 18 months later, in July 1976, 24-year-old Kathleen McSherry was a student at SIU-C. She was studying administrative science. She had just transferred from Southern Illinois University. For about a month, she had been living in a house off campus with a roommate. McSherry grew up in the Chicago, Illinois area and had a brother and a sister. On the night of July 12, 1976, McSherry's roommate left for the night at about 10 p.m. Her roommate returned home the next day at 6:12 a.m. In McSherry's bedroom, she found the dead body of the 24-year-old university student. She was naked in a pool of blood. The medical examiner determined she had been stabbed in the chest and the back with a knife that was 4 to 6 inches long. The murder weapon was not found at the crime scene. She had also been sexually assaulted. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. The police talked to the neighbors, and one of them heard screams and a dog barking around 4:30 a.m., so the police suspected that the murder happened around then. If that was the case, the police thought that McSherry had to know her killer really well to let him in her home in the middle of the night, or he possibly found an unlocked window or door. The police immediately connected the murders of Kathleen McSherry and Teresa Clark. Both were white university students in their early 20s who were sexually assaulted and stabbed to death in their homes while their roommates were out. The police eventually developed a suspect in both cases. He was 23-year-old Paul Phillips. He was a local handyman who was known for his temper. He lived across the hallway from Teresa Clark, and then he lived just a few blocks from McSherry. He was considered a person of interest because days before the murders, he had verbally harassed both women. But the police found no evidence connecting him to the murders. So like Clark's murder, McSherry's murder went cold as well. Then it appeared that the murders came to an end. Four years later, on November 10, 1981, 30-year-old Joan Wetherall was working at a Holiday Inn close to the SIU-C campus. She was a cocktail waitress at the hotel's restaurant. Wetherall, who had 4 sisters, was a former student at the university. She grew up in the Chicago area. After work that night, she planned on meeting some friends. She left the hotel at about 1 a.m. She never showed up for the meeting with her friends. They assumed that she was just too tired and went home. The next morning, her body was found in a pond outside of Elkville, Illinois. She had been bound, but whatever was used to bind her was gone. She had been struck on the head with a blunt object, most likely a hammer. But the cause of death was asphyxiation. The police didn't have a suspect, and the case quickly went cold. The police had no reason to think that Wetherall's murder was connected to the murders of Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry. At the end of summer 1981, Susan Shumake was 21 years old. She was from Chicago Heights, Illinois. That summer, she was starting her senior year at SIU-C. She was a radio-television major. She moved back to the campus a week before the semester started. Shumake had gotten a job at the campus radio. On August 17, 1981, Shumake worked at the radio station and then left to go have dinner with a friend, but she never arrived for dinner. Her friend called Shumake's roommate, and the roommate said that Shumake never returned home. So they started calling other friends looking for her. By 3:05 a.m., they couldn't find her, so they reported her missing. The day passed, and then that night, the police were searching a footpath that students used as a shortcut. An officer noticed some brush had been trampled. He went into the high brush and found the dead body of Susan Shumake. She was partially nude. The medical examiner determined she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. The police believe that she was attacked shortly after leaving the radio station. On her body, the police found 2 hairs. The police searched the area and they found Susan's backpack. Her wallet was missing. Usually, she kept about $10 in her wallet. Also near the body, they found a toiletry bag. In the bag was a prescription bottle with the name Daniel Wollison on it. The police learned that Wollison was a 21-year-old man who worked on the campus. He was a handyman at an apartment building about a quarter mile from where the body was found. He recently had been released from jail for burglary and he was on parole. Wollison was questioned and he said he had an alibi for the time of the murder. He said he was with a friend, but the police couldn't locate the friend. Wollison provided hair samples to the police. The next day, he vanished. The police searched his room and they found an odd note. It had been ripped up. Some pieces were in the toilet and other pieces were in a trash can. The police collected the pieces and put them together. The note, in part, reads, "I don't know why it's always me. I know I can't handle prison again. I know everyone is better off this way. My only regret is hurting my family." Initially, the police thought it was a suicide note. While the police searched for Wollison, his hair was compared to the hairs found on Shumake. They were not a match. So the police didn't consider him a person of interest in the murder. But the police did have another suspect. It was Paul Phillips. At the time of Shumake's murder, Phillips was working on a construction job on the campus. His hair was compared to the hairs left on Shumake. It also wasn't a match, so he was not arrested. Shumake's case also went cold. Many people believe that whoever killed Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry also killed Susan Shumake. And most people thought that was Paul Phillips. In January 1982, Paul Phillips was arrested after he attacked a couple who were camping. At gunpoint, he tied the boyfriend to a tree and pistol whipped him. He raped the girlfriend. The girlfriend was able to escape and she found help. Phillips ran off. The young woman knew Phillips because they had gone to school together. Phillips was arrested later that day and charged with rape and attempted kidnapping, amongst other crimes. He went to trial in February 1983. He was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. In May 1984, Phillips was sharing a cell with a man named Thomas McCabe. One day, Phillips talked about crimes he had committed. He said he had murdered Joan Wetherall, Kathleen McSherry, and Teresa Clark. McCabe was released in June 1984 and he went to the police. He said that when Phillips talked about the murders of McSherry and Clark, he was rambling. McCabe said he got confused about what he said about each murder. But when he talked about Wetherall's murder, he gave specific details. McCabe relayed those details onto the police. The police realized it was information that only the killer would have known. One thing Phillips told McCabe was that he transported Wetherall's body to the pond in his ex-wife's car. The police found the car, and in the back seat and the trunk, they found 28 strands of hair. 3 head hairs and 1 pubic hair could have belonged to Wetherall. In April 1986, 32-year-old John Paul Phillips was charged with the murder of Joan Wetherall. He went to trial in September 1986. Thomas McCabe was the star witness. The trial lasted 2.5 weeks. Then the jury deliberated for 9.5 hours. Phillips was found guilty of murder. In November 1986, Phillips had his sentencing hearing. Thomas McCabe testified. As he was being led off the stand, Phillips tried to fire a prison-made zip gun at him, but it didn't work and he threw the metal tube at McCabe. Phillips was restrained and the court went to recess. On another day of the hearing, Phillips spat in the face of the Assistant Attorney General. Ultimately, John Paul Phillips was sentenced to death. After he was condemned to die, the district attorney decided not to pursue any other charges against him. Many people just assumed that Phillips was also responsible for the murders of Teresa Clark, Kathleen McSherry, and Susan Shumake. Phillips never got his date with the needle. He died of natural causes at the age of 40 in 1993 in prison. Seven years later, in 2000, a new form of DNA testing called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR testing, was available. It essentially makes photocopies of parts of DNA. This allows experts to create profiles from small samples of DNA. It turned out that the DNA from Susan Shumake's case could be tested, but the evidence for Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry's cases could not because the DNA had degraded too much. In October 2001, the Carbondale police exhumed John Paul Phillips' body. They collected a DNA sample from his femur. It was compared to the DNA from Shumake's case. It was not a match. While it was surprising, especially to Susan Shumake's family, the police weren't without hope because they did have another suspect, Daniel Willison. A toiletry bag with Willison's prescription bottle was found near the crime scene. Also, he didn't have an alibi for the time of the murder. But the police weren't sure what had happened to him. He disappeared the day after the police had interviewed him, and when the police searched his room, they found what looked like a suicide note. It turned out that Willison did not die by suicide. In 2001, he was living in New Boston, Michigan. He worked at an auto salvage yard. He was divorced and he had 1 child. The police tried to talk to him, but he didn't want to cooperate. He also refused to give a sample of his DNA. The police had hair samples from Willison that they collected in 1981, but the hairs didn't have roots, which were needed for DNA testing at the time. There was also not enough evidence to get a warrant to make Willison give up a sample of his DNA. Then the police learned that Willison had recently sold his car. The police talked to the new owner, and he said that there were cigarette butts in the ashtray. They were there when he purchased the car. The police also knew that Wilson smoked, so they collected the cigarette butts and sent them for DNA testing. A DNA profile was created. It was compared to the DNA left at Shumake's crime scene. It was a match. Wilson was brought in for questioning. The investigator then used a clever ruse. Shumake's backpack was yellow, and he said that a witness came forward saying that they saw Wilson carrying a yellow backpack around the time of the murder. He also said they had Wilson's fingerprint on the backpack, but neither was true. Wilson then said he only stole $10 from the backpack. This statement was enough to get a DNA sample from Wilson. It confirmed it was his DNA left at the crime scene. 45-year-old Daniel Wilson was charged with murder. He went to trial in March 2006, 25 years after Susan Shumake was murdered. The trial lasted 4 days. Then the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. He was found guilty. A month later, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. That left 2 cases open, which were the first 2 murders, Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry. Conventional wisdom suggested that Paul Phillips killed them. After all, he confessed to their murders to his cellmate, Thomas McCabe. But the police learned from Susan Shumake's case that nothing is as clear-cut as it seems, and when it comes to a murder investigation, you can never just assume. A lot had changed since 1975 when Teresa Clark was killed. In 1975, the 3 biggest movies were Jaws, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Shampoo. 1975's biggest songs were Love Will Keep Us Together by Captain and Tennille, Rhinestone Cowboy by Glenn Campbell, and Philadelphia Freedom by Elton John. Popular books published in 1975 were the young adult tearjerker Tuck Everlasting, Larry McMurtry's family drama Terms of Endearment, and Stephen King's vampire classic Salem's Lot. In 1975, new products included the video recorder Betamax, Whack-A-Mole games, and one of the most infamous consumer products of all time, the Pet Rock. In 1975, if you were looking for something new to eat and drink, Famous Amos cookies were released, and you could get Pop Rocks and drink Miller Lite. 33 years later, in 2008, the biggest movies were the much-loved Dark Knight, the much-hated Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, and then the family-friendly Kung Fu Panda was third. In 2008, you probably heard Low by Flo Rida featuring T-Pain, Bleeding Love by Leona Lewis, and No One by Alicia Keys a lot on the radio, because they were the 3 biggest songs of the year. In 2008, young adult books were among the most popular, including the first book in the Hunger Games, the 4th book in the Twilight series, Breaking Dawn, and Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. New products introduced in 2008 include Apple's MacBook Air, the Nintendo DSi, and Hollister released their lingerie line, Gilly Hicks. As for new food and drink, you get Brew Dr. Kombucha, McDoubles became a regular menu item at McDonald's, and you could drink Summersby cider. In 2008, the police reopened the case of the 2 young women. When the case was last reopened 7 years earlier, in 2001, the DNA was too degraded. Luckily, one of those major changes that happened since the murders were committed 33 years ago was the development of a new method for creating DNA profiles. It is called Mini Short Tandem Repeat Sampling, also known as Mini STR sampling. It allows experts to create profiles from tiny and degraded samples of DNA. Compared to early forms of DNA testing, it increased the scientists' ability to identify DNA by a factor of 100. The process is complicated, and if my voice doesn't already put you to sleep, then me explaining Mini STR will. Suffice to say that the new DNA process helped get DNA from the evidence from the 2 crime scenes. The Illinois State Police DNA Lab used the technique on the DNA left at the 2 murders. They were the first law enforcement agency to use the technique. They were able to create a DNA profile. It confirmed what many people already thought. Paul Phillips was a serial killer who killed Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry. After 33 years, the murders of the Southern Illinois University-Carbondale students were finally solved. At the time of this recording, 63-year-old Daniel Wilson is serving a sentence at the Kewanee Life Skills Reentry Center in Kewanee, Illinois. He'll be able to apply for parole in September 2024. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Like we said in the opening, if you have a case you want to suggest, please visit our website, criminallylisted.com. But that's all for this week. Thank you again for listening. Please stay safe and take care of yourself.